The period of time when I was doing my PhD was one of the darkest times in my life. And it's something that I've talked about a little bit because it's been very instrumental as a turning point for various aspects of my career, my life, my understanding of myself. But I've never really talked about it on here. I definitely haven't done a long video on it. And I felt like it could be something that could be incredibly helpful. Maybe for those of you, if you are in academia, thinking about going down that route, but equally for those of you who, for different reasons, struggle with workplaces, different types of workplace culture, and you find that all of those other things in the workplace, not the actual work itself, come way bigger, way more important than they need to be. It's frustrating. We just want to get on with the job and make good things happen. And yet there feels like there's so much game playing, so much politics, so much of a challenge to just show up, be yourself, and do your best. I'm Dr. Becky Sage, and today we are going to do a bit of a story time, a bit of an exploration, a reflection of that period of my life. And for those of you who are here a lot, you may have noticed that there's been a bit of a shift and a change in my videos over the last year, and a shift again at the beginning of this year. So if you want to know more about the future of this channel and what I'm going to be exploring with you, then please hang around till the end. Those of you who've been here from the beginning, from the Spoony Squared days, I'm hoping you're going to like this change that I've decided to implement. And if you have been here since these days, please let me know in the comments, because we are a community and I show up here because I value you. And I think that by telling my story, I can do some things that maybe help other people feel seen. So let's get into the story. So let's start with the nuts and bolts. I did my PhD from 2004 to 2008. At that time, I was 22 years old when I started. I guess I was 26 when I graduated with my PhD. So it was still a pretty early part of my life. It was a very formative part of my life. Also, it was 20 years ago. Gosh, I started it 22 years ago. That's insane. So many of you might be thinking, well, perhaps this isn't relevant now. And I wish I could say to you, this isn't relevant now. I wish I could say things have changed. And some things have changed, but actually I do a lot of work with people in academia now, with PhD students, and I still see a lot of the same things that I went through. There are still changes that need to be made. My PhD was in chemical physics. For anyone who is interested, that doesn't include me, very sadly, and I will come on to this in a minute. The topic of my PhD was mass spectrometric analysis of laser ablation plumes. This video will not be about that subject, and you'll probably never see me talking about that subject because I left it behind the day I did my Viva in 2008. And that does make me sad. So I'm sitting here telling you I don't want to talk about the subject of my PhD and I'm not really interested in it. And that really started right from the beginning. So why did I do a PhD in this subject in the first place if it wasn't going to be something that I'm interested in 20 years later? It's a question I've asked myself several times, and I think there are a few different answers to that. To understand best, you have to understand where I was when I was making the decision as to what to do when I came to the end of my degree. So I'd done a 4 years integrated master's degree, and when I got to the end of that, because of my grades, because of how I'd shown up, because I graduated top of my class, I was offered a PhD. Now, for me, there didn't feel like there were any other options other than to take it. Looking back now, I know that's not the case. I know there were definitely other options, but it was a very, very difficult time. So when I say my PhD was difficult, actually it started before the PhD. The last couple of years of my undergrad degree. University was not a fun time for me. It wasn't it wasn't something that I felt good. It wasn't somewhere where I felt like I fit. I didn't really socialize very much. I lived at home a lot of the time, and I was doing part-time work. I was doing gymnastics. So university was a place I went to do my studies, and that's what I did. And I would like to say I did that fairly well, but that was my focus in that place. There were a few times when I did socialize, and coming up to like I said, the end of that degree, there were some really difficult times. There was, I had two different experiences of essay when I was, actually I think like the only two times that I socialized with people who I was on a course with. So I was in a big group, and one time there was an experience that involved several of the men, and then another time there was one individual who was kind of the ringleader of this group. And I didn't really understand what it was I was experiencing at the time. I just knew that I felt powerless. And so I'd gone over that period of time to a place where my self-esteem was incredibly low. I felt like I had nothing to offer the world. I felt like I just wanted to hide from people. What had happened from the back of that was then when I began to engage in the research world, because I did an undergrad project in the same research lab where I did my PhD, I then found myself in a very weird place in terms of trying to build friendships or relationships with my peers who were, well, I say peers, but they were already doing PhDs. They were other research students in those labs, and then there was a lot of bullying, a lot of silencing. So by the time I made the choice to do my PhD, I was, like I said, in a really, really bad place. And making the decision to do the PhD was literally like, I didn't feel like I had anything to offer the world. I had zero confidence to go and, engage with people out there in the workforce, and to sell myself in the workforce. So when I was offered the PhD, I accepted it. Within a few months of starting my PhD, I got very, very unwell. My mental health had already deteriorated a lot, and then I found myself suffering probably what I would recognize now as quite an extreme burnout. I would cry every day. I would get these extreme headaches that would just leave me in bed, and I would go into the lab to do my PhD, and then I would just be struggling. Once it got to about midday, I was done. I felt so different from everybody else who was there. I felt like I could not connect at all. I felt that there was no one who was, even trying to engage in conversation with me. People wouldn't say hello when you walked into the room. And I became incredibly withdrawn, incredibly shy, and tried to focus on the work. The issue there was that the work was also not a great project. And I look back now and I'm like, why did I do that project? I think I respected the professors that I was working for, and they were clearly very well renowned. But I look back now and I just think, how was what I was doing ever going to, first of all, allow me to follow my passions, and spending that time, that funded PhD, this thing, it was fully funded as well. I got a stipend throughout it. Why did I do what I did? And in terms of the project that I was working on, and it would have been different now. And one of my big regrets is that I kind of wish I had a PhD in the things that I'm really interested in now. I have got a few ideas of what I would want to do if I was doing a PhD again. But back then, as a 22-year-old who was struggling with a lot of things and not really knowing where to look, I just did what I felt I needed to do at that time. One of the reasons I'm a big advocate for social media is because when I was doing my PhD, I felt so alone. When I was going through those mental health challenges, those self-esteem issues, that dealing with like that fear of men in particular in a male-dominated environment, really not feeling like I was able to have a voice at all when I was there. And I had nowhere else to reach out. I had no reference points. I thought it was just me. I thought that I wasn't good enough. I thought that there was something wrong with me inherently because of the way I was feeling, as opposed to like, actually, I had something wrong with my health. I should have been dealing with that. But we didn't talk about mental health then like we do now. There wasn't an understanding. And sometimes when there's a bit of a rollback on some of this stuff, this is why I get so concerned about it. So let's talk a little bit more about those personal struggles. So what happened was, after that first few months when I got very ill, as it turns out, what I was getting was the first symptoms. Actually, it wasn't the first, but it was the symptoms that led to my chronic illness diagnosis 13 years later. And so I ended up taking about 5 months off my PhD in total. And I was able to write and get an extension. That happened because I sat down, I spoke to my supervisor, and I think it was very, very clear. In fact, I don't know who instigated that conversation, but I think it was very, very clear that I was struggling. So I sit there and say, kind of, I didn't get support, but I did get that support. At that point in time, I was also struggling a lot with an eating disorder. And in fact, that almost got worse as the PhD went along, because when I came back after I'd had that time off, I guess I was looking for the things that I could control, because I really didn't feel like I could control anything else that was going on. So in terms of myself, definitely I was struggling with mental illness, physical illness, and I had this eating disorder as well, which obviously is also a mental illness. But I think more than anything else, I lost my agency, I lost my voice, and that meant that I wasn't able to be living in alignment with where I wanted to go. Everything felt like so out of place, so lost, so like an out-of-body experience. That was the whole thing. I actually find it hard to tell this story because I have very few memories. All I really remember is this like darkness, this sadness, this feeling out of place. I remember lying on the sofa with these really bad headaches, and that's my memories of doing this PhD. I remember going by for months because we had to wait for my equipment to come from the manufacturer, and because this is a scientific PhD, it was all about like building equipment, collecting data, like validating what it is that you've built, and you know, there's only so much of reading the papers you could do. I mean, I say that now, I definitely know I could have done more and I could have been more excited, but I think I'd just lost any love of anything, any love of life. And of course, at that time, I was an undiagnosed autistic person. I just didn't know that because I was undiagnosed. There was no talk of any of this. We're talking times when there was still some rhetoric about the fact that autism was a boys-only thing. And actually, there had been times when people would have seen me as like quite a bubbly person, quite an outgoing person, somebody who does answer questions, and then I really, really withdrew when I was doing my PhD. So I've briefly mentioned some of those relationships that I had. The key people, of course, are the other people in your lab, and like I said, I think there was a lot of people there who probably were feeling withdrawn, feeling not great, but I would see them as other people who they weren't talking to me. I also wasn't talking to them because I was so withdrawn at that time. And they were people who, to me, it seemed like they were really into their projects, really passionate about what it was they were doing. They were able to kind of have these conversations that they actually cared about. And I didn't feel like I could do that. It felt very disingenuous, very inauthentic whenever I spoke about my project. And I wish I'd caught that earlier on. And I will come on a little bit later on to like what I wish I would have done differently. And of course, so that also tells you a bit more about that culture that was going on at that time as well. Because if you imagine new people coming in to do a PhD, walking into a lab and just feeling isolated, and this is a story I hear time and time and time again. There are things now called doctoral training centres or centres for doctoral training, and they can be really great because they actually spend a year getting you used to kind of different research processes, getting to know each other, getting to know different people, you know, different academics, different researchers, and they teach you a lot more in those early days. And you don't actually fully pick your project until later on, so you have time to do that, and I so wish that that was something that was there when I was doing my PhD, and I'm really happy that some people get to experience that now, because I think it makes the world of difference. The other thing about the culture is it was all built on what I call intellectual superiority, although I realise now that it's less to do with brain power, but actually a perception of intellectual superiority. Who can talk the loudest? Who is the most confident in their assertions, as opposed to what actually makes sense? How do we actually have discussions? It was not a psychologically safe environment for me. I didn't feel like I could speak. If I did, I often got shut down. Now, this also comes from when I was in the research lab the year before as an undergraduate, and I literally had somebody in that lab that would go every time I tried to speak. Somebody who, when we were on a social, and I realize I keep talking about these social things, there were very few of them, but a lot of the culture was like, who are you making friends with down the pub? Like, you have to go to the pub on Friday nights. Now, I was already in a place where I felt incredibly unsafe with my peers, and then to have to go out at night, also experiencing a chronic illness and undiagnosed autism, which shows up in terms of like my challenges with social situations and overstimulation from those social situations. This was just such a bad way for me to be able to engage with those people around me, my peers. So this whole culture that exists in academia, and again, it has shifted now. I have seen things change from this regard, although there's some things where it still exists like this. It just left me feeling less and less safe. So less and less able to put any ideas across, less and less able to feel like I had a voice even within my own project, my own pathways. And if this is you, if this is what you're going through now, I really hope that you can find a way to have your voice heard. And I will tell you a few things I did later on during my PhD that I think helped with that. And certainly things I do now that help with that. And I've also already mentioned the kind of wider world that we existed within. There have been lots of changes in the last 20 years in terms of an understanding of what good culture is, of kind of social structures. And I do have a fear that there is a backlash to different aspects of what makes a workplace a good workplace. For me, if you can even just focus in on that core of psychological safety, how do you make sure that everyone has psychological safety such that everybody can contribute and everybody is able to work in a way where they're not in fight or flight the entire time? I realise I haven't been that specific about some of the challenges that I had. Obviously, I've talked about some of those personal ones. I've talked about some things to do with my project. The reality was the science was never the issue. The technology was never the issue. I did my work. I got through the end. I got a PhD. I never thought about it again. That's not true. I do think about it. But I got through that process. That was not the challenge. Although there's all sorts of things that we can talk about in terms of how to make that the most effective experience, how to then use your PhD as a platform to move on in your career. The other thing in terms of the wider world was that there was less of an understanding then that a PhD could be useful for other things. And certainly with my background, my experience, all I was looking at was this academic pathway. And I didn't really know whether I wanted to be on an academic pathway or not, but I didn't really know how to make that decision either. And PhDs were very much built, and I definitely heard it said many, many times back then that doing a PhD is meant to be like running a gauntlet. Like the whole idea wasn't to be psychologically safe. It wasn't to make it a good environment. It was to make it a horrible environment and see who survived, because then that's who can go on into academia. And that just is such a terrible approach to anything. When we talk about PhDs, when we talk about scientific research, publicly funded scientific research, this should be about nurturing minds. This should be about getting ideas that represent different people from across society. It should be about making the most effective use of that money in order to be able to have breakthroughs. And yet, there was this whole idea of, no, it's about running a gauntlet to see who can survive on the other side. Well, there's several reasons why people may or may not survive. And being part of the old boys club is going to make it much easier for you to survive than if you're not part of that club. The reason a lot of women struggled at that time was not because they were struggling with the science, they were struggling with the technology. It was because they were being gatekept. And that gatekeeping is something I still see now, purely because of the way somebody looks, the way somebody talks, because we don't fit the mold. Well, not fitting the mold is really kind of perfect when it comes to innovation. People who don't fit the mold should be invited in, because innovation equals change, and yet we're innovating in these environments where people are resistant to change. There's a massive clash there. So one of the interesting things is that I convinced myself that I wasn't smart enough, that I wasn't good enough to be in this environment. And like, I look back now and I think that was such a silly thing to think. There was no evidence at that point that I was not smart enough. I had literally been offered this PhD because I'd graduated top of my class. Were there things I didn't understand? Sure, there were definitely things I didn't understand. Those things I didn't understand were about how the culture worked, about how to engage with people. I didn't understand my own mental state and how to overcome that. I didn't understand certain things that other people did. But not being smart enough wasn't the problem. Or maybe it was. Maybe I wasn't smart enough to see that I should have done a different project, that I should have really tackled those challenges head on. But it was a different time, it was a different world, it was a different part of my life. So what did help me? Because there were things that helped, and I would say that the darkest years were kind of in that beginning time, and then things got a little easier once I kind of went into the second part of the PhD. So the things that helped me were to get involved with things outside of that environment. So anything I was doing that was outside of the environment, that lab, that office that I was in, those people that I was surrounded by, all of those things really helped. So the first thing I did, and actually this wasn't even necessarily totally different people, but there were some of the same professors there. And of course, I just want to quickly mention that, which is one of the challenges with a PhD is that there's a lot of hierarchy, right? And you have the big professors, they're very well renowned, they ultimately are attracting a lot of the money in, you're building off their research, their work, their credibility. And they're incredibly busy people. Sometimes they care, sometimes they don't really care about the people. I would say that the ones that I worked with did care about the people. I don't know that they necessarily always had the right knowledge and experiences to engage with different types of people. But I think there was a sense that they did care, they did want to get the best out of people. And I know at that time I wasn't able to articulate what was going on for me. And so what ends up happening is you end up spending a lot of time with people who are more junior, who've had no experience whatsoever in terms of managing people or working with people closely, who have a technical background, they've come through a scientific degree. In our scientific degrees, we don't do anything to do with teamwork. It's a bit different again now, well, sometimes it's different now, but back then it really wasn't. Like, it was such an individual pursuit. I ended up being not managed, but certainly those people who are more senior to you and who are around you all the time are not necessarily equipped to be able to engage with you, to support you, to help you. And having worked in university environments again, I do think that there's a lot of game playing that goes on in these environments. There's a lot of one-upmanship. And I mentioned this idea of intellectual superiority. There's a lot of that, like, how do I just show that I'm, it's not even about doing the right things, doing the best things, having the most impact. A lot of it is about, playing all those games, how you position yourself. And none of those things have come naturally to me ever in my life. And it's really why I've not been in the workplace. So it's why I much prefer working for myself. So yeah, the things that I did was to take myself to new environments where I was around people who actually did know how to get the best out of people. One of those big things was doing outreach work. So we got trained to then communicate science to schools or to the public or in other environments. And so I did quite a lot of that during my PhD. And actually, some of that really did lead to a lot of the things that I did later on in my career. In fact, we even have there's a paper published on this work, led by an amazing man who trained many of us, called Tim Harrison. So getting out there, doing things where I was engaging with the public or with children was really fantastic in terms of changing the way I felt about myself. It helped me to regain my self-esteem. Now, there was still a point of view within the university that this type of work was less than. It was less important. It had less kudos, less credibility. And I think that's a big part of a lot of the issues that we see now. Again, it's shifted a little bit in some places, but in some places it really hasn't. The other things that really helped, I went to conferences and I met people who, like, you know, other PhD students from around the world. I won actually a scholarship to go to one conference, and then I also went to a conference in Tenerife, and that was just a really great way to engage with people. And I actually still message some of the people I met at that conference. And then the other thing I did whilst I was there, and this actually helped me, and again, I've created friends that I kept into the future, and that was doing UCAS visits and organising events within the school that I was in. And that helped me to meet different professors. It helped me to meet different PhD students, to get out of that small bubble that had been a place that didn't feel good for me. And I think that was really the first time I started to see other PhD students as people. And then the final thing that I did, which then led to other things, was I went away for a week. At that point, the funders did actually fund you in the middle of your PhD to go away for this like PhD school, grad school, or I can't remember what it was called, but it was like a week of team building and different exercises. It was like, finally, we're getting these kind of this kind of training. That was a really instrumental week for me, because when I got to the end of that week, we had like a vote or something as a group, and the group like voted me most likely to lead or most likely to gel the group together or something like that. And I was like, what was that about? And each group had a mentor, and the mentor wrote a card for everyone in the group. And on her card, she said something along the lines of, don't forget to step up, or don't underestimate your abilities to be a leader, or something like that. And that was such a turning point for me. She was somebody who volunteered for the Terence Higgins Trust, and one of the things I did when I got back was to start volunteering as well. So again, it was doing things outside of the PhD to develop further skills, as well as completing my PhD at the same time. So working with the Terence Higgins Trust, again, I got lots of training. I got exposed to a totally different world. And I did that for a really long time after finishing my PhD as well. I was a buddy for somebody who had been recently diagnosed with HIV, and I was there to support them in different ways. And like I said, got the training in order to do that. So all of these things made for a much fuller, a much rounder experience. But also I was really struggling just in that, you know, that core academic space, because I guess I'd been really burned by it and had some experiences that weren't good. I do want to say something here about toxic environments, because not everything is toxic to everything. So, for example, water is innocuous, right? If you put potassium in water, it is gonna catch on fire. And I definitely recognize that when I did my PhD, it was a combination of where I was and who I was at that time and the environment that I was going into. And it was those two things coming together that was destructive for me. But like I said, there are ways in which working environments, especially those where you know you've got people coming in very early on in their career, those environments should be made in such a way that you can nurture people and get the best out of them. Because guess what? If you're funding them for 3 years and then they're potentially going to go on to have or that they are going to go on to have a career, you want to get the best out of these people. And if it's a dark time, then it's going to be an incredibly difficult future for that person. So what would I have done differently now? There are lots of things I did do. I did get help from the counselling service at university, and I found it to be the most terrible thing I'd ever been to. I did also, I can remember going to my GP at some point as well. Obviously I went to the doctor because I was going through these like chronic illness symptoms as well. So I was being seen by several people. What I guess I was doing, which didn't help, was I was still putting on a very positive front. I didn't just say it how it was. And I can even remember going to a doctor once and them saying, well, she looks fine. And so I think that I definitely could have done more to ask for help, ask for support, to really show what I was going through. I didn't feel like I could do that at the time. I felt way too vulnerable. I hadn't told anyone about the eating disorder at that point as well. There was a lot of shame associated with that. And that was making me quite unwell too. So there were all these personal things that were definitely going on, and I could have asked for more help. The other thing I would have also done differently is, and this would have required me to have been in a healthier place, but I would have chosen a different project. Doing a PhD that you're not like fully passionate about is not a great thing. I think it's really important to pick something that isn't just about, oh, I just kind of, because this is the area I happen to be tinkering around in. Where do you want to really see a change in the world, and that can still be like something that's highly technical. It doesn't have to necessarily be an applied space, but where do you want your contributions to be? Because even now, people, if they want to know what my PhD is in, they want to talk to me about that. They think that, and sometimes they even say, oh, I should introduce you to so-and-so because they're also doing work in that. And I'm like, I wouldn't be able to hold a conversation 20 years later on what I did in my PhD. And it's not the pathway that my career is on either. I do think there are more things that organizations can do, and I think there is best practice that exists already. One thing that I think is incredibly important is to open up the eyes, or open up different pathways for PhD students. So it's not just about that academic pipeline. It's about all of the different avenues you might go down, technical or otherwise, that you could use your passion, your love, your skills, your talents, and you could develop new talents to go down those different pathways. So for example, you all know that I'm in entrepreneurship, so I think that there should have been more entrepreneurial training. There is quite often now within PhDs some kind of entrepreneurial training, and I think that needs to stay. I also think more engagement with industry and looking at those different industry pathways would be really helpful. Different application focus, different social impact focus. I already mentioned communications and outreach and events, and I think doing things that create a more rounded person is really important, because even if somebody's going down like a pure academic track, those skill sets are incredibly important. Whether that person knows it or not, they are important. Things like communication, things like thinking about the impact of your work, things like creating networks, ecosystems around what you do. That's all going to support you in the future, whichever path you go down. I also think there's still a lot of silos. You have to choose very early on, and you end up in this very narrow area of work. And I get that, because it's like, okay, everyone here is going deep. You're going to meet all the people that have spent 50 years going deep in this area, and that's how you're going to expand. But actually, I think some of the most interesting things happen at the intersections of different fields. So I think more cross-pollination across different fields is something that could be really important. I also think that anyone, and actually this should be part of the PhD training, should be management and leadership skills. That should come into it, and I don't think that really comes into it very much at all. That course, that week-long thing I went to, and that's not something that really happens anymore. They do it in different ways now. But what has doing a PhD done for me? Now, it's largely about other people's perception, because I wouldn't say that running that gauntlet, getting to the end, really did do much. It was very much a black hole in my life when I look back. That and then the next couple of years after that were incredibly hard. And when I say like I feel like I'm lucky to come out the other side of that, I do. I'm actually, I feel like I kind of survived by, you know, all the mental health struggles, holding on by my fingertips. And I actually do think you know, we know that when there are neurological changes when you go through burnouts, when you go through like these incredibly anxious and difficult times. And so I think I was less smart when I came out than I was when I went in to that PhD. If I was to look back just on my life and say, like, would I do that again? In terms of what it gave me internally, no. However, externally, it has given me a lot of things. And so I do want to recognize that, because number one, just to say like that perception is probably false. In fact, there are lots of other reasons why lots of other things I bring to the table that give me a lot stronger perspectives, knowledge, experience than that period of time gave me. However, that period of time did give me a PhD. That's allowed me to engage with different people across science and technology broadly. It's what enabled me to really move forward in terms of working in research and development, the funding of research and development, and therefore ultimately going on to doing my first startup. It also has allowed me to teach in universities because I have a PhD. It's allowed me to have that kind of credibility behind anything I'm doing in a knowledge-intensive environment. So it definitely has helped for many of those reasons. Has that balanced those other things? Maybe now, when I'm getting to the point where I'm just about kind of getting through it 20 years later, and it does still impact me, and some of the things that happened still impact me now. But I have worked through it. I've done the work to get through it. So, and I like to say now, I guess kind of leaving it on a positive note and really coming back to that personal side of it, because it was all about my own personal journey. Perhaps it made me more human to go through things where I really struggled and to get out the other side. It's allowed me to connect with other people on a much deeper level. It's allowed me to break down some of my walls and dig deeper and understand who I am beyond this kind of academic achievement or high performance, which is what I, shielded myself behind for many years of my life. And that has helped me to form wider connections, to get to know people better. This was meant to be quite a short video, and I realise I've been rabbiting on for a really, really long time. I hope it's been helpful for you to hear these experiences. If you've got more questions, about specifics around doing the PhD, getting through the PhD, surviving in the workplace, I have got other videos on some of these topics, but do let me know in the comments. I'd really like to know from you if you want to know more about some of these experiences and being on that academic pathway, because one thing that you may or may not know about me now is that I have recently been successful in obtaining a Royal Society position as an entrepreneur in residence at the University of Bath. And in that role, I am being, first of all, recognised by the Royal Society, like the globally leading institution for scientists who come together, or people who care about science and the impact of science. I'm also working across the university to make some of these changes. So my experiences have played into that, and by going through this, I hope to be able to create environments that are going to work better for other people. Do let me know in the comments if you've got anything else to add, any further questions. Oh, I said I was going to talk about what I'm doing with this channel. Right, so those of you who are subscribed to me here, and if you're not, do get subscribed if you like what you're about to hear. This channel started as a way to explore my recent autism diagnosis, and through that I've connected with many of you. I did a bit of a pivot because I'll do a bigger video about this, but I really wanted to be creating content that was aligned to my day-to-day work, that was helping me expand my knowledge, helping me to explore new topics related to technology, business, its impact on society. However, when I did that, I realised I wasn't connecting with those people that I initially was connecting with on this channel. So I had a bit of a shift, like figuring out what's coming naturally to me, what do I want to be talking about, how do I want to be connecting with you. And the reality is I want to do both those things. I want to do that business, tech, exploration side of things, but I also want to be doing this personal journey and what it is to be neurodivergent in the workplace, what it is to have some of these experiences and exploring related topics. I've made a decision to go back to Spoonie Squared on this channel. We'll be exploring what it is to be neurodivergent and ambitious. I will then be creating a new channel, so anyone who's interested in the tech, in the business, in the entrepreneurship, specifically those side of things, and there will be some overlap of course, but if you're interested in those things, I will be creating a new channel, so keep your eyes open for that. It will be coming very soon. And all of you OGs on this channel, stick around because I am here for you and I really appreciate all the things you've done for me over the years, and I want to continue to build this community. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end, give me a hands up in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.